Welcome to this next video series on IFS. In this video series I want to focus on IFS as a therapy, as a therapeutic approach. Whereas before we talked more about the model of the mind, how the mind works, what makes the psyche function the way it does. In this video it's really more about the approach to therapy. How does IFS therapy work and what are the principles on which it's based? Before we dive into that, I think it makes a lot of sense to ask ourselves, how does a healthy psyche look? So, if therapy is about helping people have healthier psyches, then there must be some sort of idea of how a healthy psyche looks. And IFS actually has a pretty clear idea of how a healthy psyche would look. For a healthy psyche, we would have healthy parts. So parts that are not burdened, that are not in some protective role, that are not in an exile role, but parts that are healed, parts that are healthy. That means they can actually do what they're made for. They can take their healthy roles, do the things in our life that they're good at, and they do that without the burden of the past. So without the pain or the roles they've taken on in the past. Now, all of these healthy parts, of course, are not just in the storage of a psyche. Again, remember the model, storage, active, seat of consciousness. If you don't remember this, please watch those videos. I don't want to repeat all of that. But they can become active as well. But in a healthy psyche, the idea of parts being active is that they come active, but they don't take over the seat of consciousness. So in a healthy psyche, the part would be there. It would influence what's happening, how we're feeling, how we perceive the world, what we do, how we interact with people, with ourselves, with whatever task we're doing. But they wouldn't take over the seat of consciousness. The self would still be present. And actually, the self, as the natural inhabitant of the seat of consciousness, would be the leader of the inner system. So in whatever situation we're in, the self would be the leader, meaning the parts influence, but in the end the self still has the capacity, the presence and the power to make decisions, to choose what's happening and to interact with parts when they might get a little bit overwhelmed, when the parts get too active. So it would be very normal that different parts come up at different times. Also that maybe multiple parts are active. Totally normal, totally healthy, as long as the self is present and as long as these parts are healthy, meaning they're not in a protective role where they think they need to protect, or they're not exiles who are carrying old pain. They will interact with the self, they will have trust in the self, and through that the system can actually adapt to what's going on. And when a part is not needed anymore, it will relax and the self will be there. The self will be present. And that's the idea of how a healthy psyche looks. Now, as we've seen in the last videos, this is not how a psyche normally looks. This is not how the inner system of people normally works. So how does it usually look? Just to repeat very quickly, we often have healthy parts, but we also have many not healthy parts, here represented as these action figures. They have a role, they think they really need to protect something. And these action figures are very active because they think they need to protect something. And what they think they need to protect are the exiles, are the small child parts that are cast out from our consciousness and that are in pain from the past. So the protectors really need to protect these parts so that they don't get hurt again, but also so that they don't come active. And to do that, they often are very, very active, so they're more active than they need to. It's not like, now I need to be here, okay, now I can relax. But they often stay very active, and what they often do is they take over the seat of consciousness. So they don't allow the self to be present, but rather take over so much that we think we are that part, that we turn into that part, that all that's there is the perceptions, the feelings, the actions of that part. And then maybe if this part actually does relax, go down because the exile is not threatened anymore, then another part takes over. And we just go from part to part to part, often have multiple parts present, fighting with each other, maybe even fighting in the seat of consciousness, both being kind of blended. I want this, but I also want that. That's more of how a normal psyche, how an inner system of a person usually looks. It's not as fluid, it's not as free. The self is often not present, or if so, only for very short times before another part takes over again. And that's what IFS works with. That's where IFS therapy comes in, and what it tries to improve. It tries to improve the state of the inner system. Now, as far as I can see, and this goes back to interviews with Richard Schwartz, but also the different IFS books and trainings I've done, there are roughly 4 goals that IFS therapy has that it's aiming for. And those 4 goals are, number 1, unburdening parts. So we talked about the burden a part carries. The burden meaning the exile carrying pain from the past, and that pain, those strong emotions, beliefs, are a burden. The part is carrying that, and it's like he's never gotten out of that situation. That's the burden of an exile. But also, the protectors are carrying burdens because their role is their burden. So, an exile, so a protector that is in that strong protective role is carrying a burden, which is the role. They are not doing what they're actually there for. They're doing something because they think they need to protect the exile. They think they need to protect the system from the exile. So the role is their burden. And one of the goals of IFS therapy is to unburden the parts. To unburden them meaning to help them let go of the old pain and to help them let go of their roles so that they can return to their healthy capacities. So in IFS, each part has a healthy capacity. That means every part has something that it is naturally made for, something it can bring to our inner world and our life. That can be joyously interacting with other people, or self-compassion, or trust, or clear-minded thinking. All of these things, these healthy capacities, are what different parts are there for. And once a part has let go of its burden, being that the pain or the role, they can return to that healthy capacity and they can actually fulfill what they're there for. They can do and perform what they're made for. So that's the second goal. Goal 1 is to unburden. Goal 2 is to then free those natural capacities of our inner part. Goal 3 of IFS therapy is supporting the trust between the self and parts. Now, we talked about it with the inner system, that in a healthy system the self is present and the self can interact with the parts. And that's actually how IFS views the self in the inner system. The self is the leader of the inner system, and the parts trust the self to be able to handle situations. That means even when we're in a situation that's too much for a part, or where a part gets worried, that part can still trust self enough so that it allows the self to be in that situation, to handle that situation. It's also about, for some parts, actually learning that the self exists. Many parts believe they are the only part that can do the job. They don't even know that we have a self, that we are a self. So for them, learning, wow, there is a self, is a huge step. And for them trusting that the self is there, that the self is not 4 years old anymore, but we're an adult, is a huge step for that part to be able to trust the self, to allow the self in during the therapy, but also in life, to allow the self to be present and to take its role, which is the fourth goal of IFS therapy, establishing the self as the leader of the system. So when the parts start to trust the self can actually become what it naturally is meant to be, which is the leader of the inner system. That means that when two parts are in conflict with each other or fighting, the self can be there as a presence to coordinate them, to be with them, to hear both, to allow both of them to be there. When we're in a situation in our life that is difficult to handle, the self is the leader that can interact with the parts but also be actively in the world. That's what the self is, the leader of the system, both internally but also in the world, how a system interacts with other people, with challenges, with problems we have. That's what the self is there to be and to do, but mostly to be. So those are the four goals. It's unburdening the parts, allowing them to return to their healthy capacities, establishing trust between the parts and the self, and then establishing the self as the leader in the system, internally and in our life. Those are the four goals of IFS therapy. Before I dive into the principles behind IFS therapy and an example and the tools IFS therapy is using in the next few videos, I want to describe a little bit what the space is IFS offers in therapy. Because IFS therapy, in essence, is a space for the self and the parts to connect. That can mean in a real therapeutic session where you're sitting with a therapist, the space is actually there for yourself and your parts to connect. All the therapist is there for is allowing that connection to happen and not allowing that interaction and communication to happen. That's what the therapist is there for. But it can also mean being by yourself and finding a way that yourself and your parts can interact. So in essence, therapy in IFS happens through the interaction of self and parts. And all this therapeutic process of IFS is, with all the tools, with all the steps, is establishing that interaction, establishing that relationship between the self and the parts. And then in the next few videos, I want to dive into how IFS facilitates that, how an IFS therapist might facilitate that. But that core, that the healing and the therapy itself is about the connection between self and part. That's so important. I think that really is the core of everything IFS is trying to offer to people.
You never know what's around